Linda, and this is Coffee and Crime. This podcast explores real cases involving violence, loss, and the darker side of human nature. Some details may be confronting. Listener discretion is strongly advised. Some disappearances don't just leave behind a missing person. They leave behind a rewritten reality. A version of events that gets repeated so many times it starts to feel true, even when it doesn't quite sit right. And that's what happened in the case of Lynette Dawson, a young mother from Sydney's northern beaches who vanished in January 1982, and she was never seen again. But this story isn't just about Lynette. It's about what happens inside a family when one parent disappears and the remaining parent controls the story that replaces them. At the centre of it all is her daughter, Lynette Dawson, who would spend decades trying to reconcile memory, truth, and loyalty. And at the centre of the suspicion is her father, Chris Dawson. But before any courtrooms, podcasts, or convictions, there was just a day at the beach and a mother who never showed up. January 1982 started like any other summer day in Sydney. Warm air, bright sun, families planning outings. According to Chris Dawson, the morning began with a simple routine. He claimed that he drove Lynette to a bus stop so she could return some clothing to a shop. After that, she was supposed to meet her mother later in the day for a family picnic at a swimming pool. A relaxed, ordinary outing. But Lynette never arrived. Instead, Chris turned up alone with the children. 4-year-old Chanel and 2-year-old Sharon. And this is where one of the most important and unsettling moments of the entire case sits quietly in the background. The picnic wasn't just any location. It was a family gathering at a pool near the beach. The kind of place where everything feels normal on the surface. Kids running around, adults chatting, food laid out on picnic tables, the sound of water in the background. But Lynette wasn't there, and her absence was immediately noticeable to the people waiting for her. Chris had an explanation. He said he had dropped her off earlier in the day and that she simply hadn't arrived yet. But for Lynette's family, something didn't add up. Because this wasn't like her. She wouldn't just not show up. And she certainly wouldn't disappear without contact. As the day unfolded, that gap between what was said and what was actually happening became the first crack in a story that would eventually collapse entirely. For Chanel, the day isn't remembered in detail. It's remembered in fragments. And one of those fragments involves the poolside setting of that picnic. The smell of the fresh summer air, the bright light reflecting off the water. The confusion of being somewhere she was supposed to be with her mother, who wasn't there. Children don't process absence the way that adults do. They notice feelings first. Confusion, discomfort, a sense that something is missing but not understanding what. At one point during the outing, Chanel remembers challenging something that her father said about Lynette's whereabouts. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't dramatic. Just a child trying to understand why things didn't match. But the reaction was immediate. Chris reportedly pulled her aside and scolded her. Not loudly enough for anyone to notice, but firmly enough that she never forgot how it felt. That moment stayed with her for decades. Because it wasn't just about being told off. It was about learning very early on that there was a correct version of the story and anything else was not allowed, even if it was true. In the beginning, Chris Dawson's explanation for Lynette's disappearance sounded simple. She had left. She needed space. She would come back when she was ready. But she didn't. And as time passed, the explanation shifted. Maybe she'd joined a religious group. Maybe she'd moved to another part of Australia. Maybe she'd gone overseas. Each version replaced the last, but none of them came with evidence, and none of them brought Lynette home. For Chanel, growing up inside that changing story meant learning to adapt to uncertainty without being allowed to question it. And that kind of environment slowly shapes how reality is understood. Inside the family home, Lynette gradually disappeared in a very literal way. No photos, no stories, no reminders. It wasn't just that she was gone. It was that she was no longer discussed. Chanel would later describe how unusual it felt in hindsight. Because even in families dealing with loss, people tend to preserve memory. But here, memory seemed to be avoided. Conversations about Lynette created silence, not curiosity, not grief shared openly, silence. And that silence became part of Chanel's upbringing. Something that felt normal at the time, but deeply unnatural when viewed later in life. Chanel wasn't the only child growing up in this environment. Her younger sister, Sharon Dawson, was also being raised in the aftermath of Lynette's disappearance. But their experiences were very different. Sharon was very young when Lynette vanished, too young to remember her clearly. So her understanding of her mother came entirely from what she was told. And for much of her life, that meant believing that Lynette had simply left. As soon as public suspicion around Chris Dawson grew over the years, the two sisters began moving in opposite emotional directions. Chanel began questioning. Sharon remained loyal to her father. After Chris Dawson was convicted in 2022, that divide became permanent. Sharon is reported to have continued supporting her father and maintaining doubt about the verdict. Chanel, on the other hand, accepted the outcome of the court. And between those two positions, a family quietly fractured. Because when two siblings process the same trauma in completely different ways, there is often no way back to the middle. As the years passed, Chanel found herself caught in something deeply isolating. She was grieving her mother, questioning her father and trying to hold together relationships that were slowly becoming impossible to maintain. She has described the experience as emotionally exhausting, a constant internal conflict between love and suspicion. And even as public attention increased, especially after the teacher's pet reignited global interest in the case, her personal struggle remained private. Listening to the case unfold publicly meant reliving her own childhood in real time. But this time, the world had an opinion, and that made everything heavier. When Chris Dawson was finally arrested in 2018, everything changed again. The version of reality Chanel had grown up with was no longer sustainable. The man she knew as her father was now facing murder charges. And the case that had been spoken about quietly for decades became national news. The arrest was not just a legal moment, it was a psychological one, because it forced an entire family to confront something that they had avoided for years. That the missing mother's story might never have been true in the way that it was told. In August 2022, the court delivered its decision. Chris Dawson was found guilty of murdering Lynette Dawson. For many observers, it felt like long-awaited justice. But for Chanel, it wasn't simple relief. It was layered, painful, final. It was unavoidable. Because even with a conviction, the emotional reality doesn't resolve neatly. A mother is still gone. A father is still convicted. And a childhood is still permanently altered. During sentencing, Chanel made the decision to read her victim impact statement herself. Standing in court, she spoke directly to her father. She spoke about loss, about confusion, about the life Lynette should have had with her daughters. And she asked the question that sits at the centre of so many cases like this. Why not just leave? Why remove a mother entirely from her children's life? The weight of those questions is what gives this case its lasting impact. Because beneath everything, investigations, trials, media coverage, the core remains simple. A child lost her mother, and that absence shaped everything that followed. Today, Chanel continues to navigate life after the trial. She has spoken about grief that doesn't disappear with time, trust that takes years to rebuild, and memories that shift depending on how the truth is understood. But she has also described moments of change, small moments where grief softens slightly, where remembering Lynette becomes less painful and more human. Not just loss, but love. And that shift matters, because for decades, Lynette Dawson was defined by what happened to her. A disappearance, a suspicion, a case file. But for her daughter, she was always something much simpler. A mother who missed every single day. The story of Lynette Dawson will always be remembered for its investigation and its outcome. But the deeper story is quieter. It lives in memory, in silence, in fractured families, and in two sisters who grew up in the same house but left it with completely different understandings of the truth. One accepted the court's decision. One still holds on to belief shaped by a lifetime of loyalty. And somewhere between them is the absence of a mother who should have been there all along. Not every case finds closure. Not every question gets answered. And sometimes the truth stays buried long after the headlines fade. This has been Coffee and Crime AU. For deeper into the case, visit Coffee and Crime AU online. Until next time.